you just start off by introducing yourselves and the name of your ticket?
Do you want to go?
Well, we're Bloom, Honi, I'm Max, and this is Juliet.
Great. So you're framing yourselves as an experience ticket per your policy statement with regards to sort of contributions to the paper and editorial experience sort of largely elsewhere on campus. Yet your experience within the SRC as an organisation is arguably somewhat limited. How will you be making up for these gaps in knowledge when you start editing the paper?
Well, I think that we still have a few members that have been involved factionally and have been involved in the SRC as well. But we think that it's actually probably a benefit that we haven't been involved in the SRC to a great extent, because it means that we are able to approach things, I guess, more objectively. But also we are open to obviously getting to know the SRC and getting to know all the positions. And also we have been following it from a kind of distance. So we're still aware of all the positions that are held and what the SRC is essentially responsible for. We just haven't necessarily been actually involved actively within the SRC itself.
Cool. And one of the first things you'll be doing as editors in sort of early December is covering NatCon. Do you believe that you're sufficiently prepared for this, particularly given it's live and it's a very hectic environment? It'll probably be on Zoom this year, but do you think you're prepared at the moment?
We haven't really thought about it, to be honest. We'll cross that bridge fairly shortly, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
I don't see why we wouldn't be prepared. I think it would be like any other event that we were to cover.
Yeah. And you've said that you'll, in your policy statement, conduct extensive investigations, yet nobody on next year's editorial team, we believe, has ever published investigatively for Honi. How can you assure students and Honi's readership that you do have this skill set?
I think while we haven't done any articles that have been framed as investigations as such, we still have, we're very much willing to go out and do the digging and speak to people. And I think just by being involved more in uni life and around the SRC, we'll have a greater opportunity to do that once we're in our positions. So I don't think there will be any barrier to us doing investigations.
Yeah, and is there anything sort of specific that you'd like to be looking into?
Well, I think we can't predict what investigations will happen. We just pitched you an investigation that we investigated and there was nothing to investigate really.
Yeah.
So I don't think we can say what we're going to investigate without knowing if there's anything to it.
Sure thing. And then so much of editing Honi is obviously about relationships with people on campus, so sort of for example the NTU. Do you believe that you already have these relationships, and if not, how are you going to go about sort of developing these connections? So I've just been marking the quiz in the meantime, which Vivian and DeAndre have done. And for example, you weren't able to name the national president of the NTU, and next year, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the EBA expires, so you'll likely be covering that, and there's the potential for sort of strike action, which has happened in the last sort of 2013, 2017. Do you think, are you worried about those sort of critical gaps in knowledge?
Well, I think that across our ticket, because there are 10 people, it's not just isolated individuals, that we have quite diverse contacts, and we also have positions in different parts of campus life. And of course, we'd have to get to know new people, but that's kind of part of working with any publication. So we're open to getting to know these people and also having to learn new things along the way. No ticket goes into Honi completely prepared for everything. No one knows everything, and I guess that we need to approach it with an open mind and kind of a willingness to learn.
Yeah.
And I think we'd be leaning on FIT to pass on some of their contacts, and we'd be talking with you and other people who know those kind of people and getting in contact with people, because we might not know them directly at the moment, but as editors, they're people we'll have to get to know. So that's, I think we'll be trying to get to know as many people as possible.
Of course. And there was another sort of interesting gap in general knowledge where Vivian and DeAndre named Dan Tahan as the state education minister. Do you think that sort of signifies some general, some sort of like lack of general knowledge. Like obviously you're not going to know everyone on campus now, and that's a process which we'll obviously help you with and which will happen next year. But naming a federal education minister who's been, in the news sort of every day for the past few months because of what's happening to universities at the moment isn't a particularly good look.
Yeah, well, knowing every politician is also like not necessarily going to be in everyone's ballpark. And obviously also the quiz is representative of like 2 people on our ticket, not necessarily all 10. And whilst they are representatives of our ticket, it also doesn't mean that like the knowledge represented there is the complete knowledge of all the ticket. So I think that also needs to be taken into account when we're looking at the experience or the knowledge of Bloom as a whole.
Great. And just moving on now, what would you say Bloom's vision for Honi is? And further to that, what do you think the role of Honi is on campus?
I think one of Bloom's main things is obviously there'll be a lot of continuation with what FIT has done in being a fairly progressive ticket. And there's always that role of a student newspaper being, pushing the boundaries to an extent. But I think Honi has a great potential in a time where people are really disconnected from uni. Even before Corona, people just spend not much time on campus, not get involved with many societies. You don't really have any connection to university life. And even those who do spend quite a bit of time around might not be interested in Honi and the things that gets printed in it. So I think one of the things we want to do is try and increase readership as much as possible and just get as many people involved in writing and reading the paper, because that's really one of the only ways we get to know people, know what's going on in campus and feel more connected and know what's going on. And that's it's a hard thing to do at the moment, but I think you just have to get out and, almost shove it down people's throats.
And the role of Honi more broadly as well. I guess that university newspapers and publications generally have a kind of unique position within the market, one could say, because we aren't under the command of this kind of Murdoch authority figure, and thus we are able to make statements and opinions that are probably contrary from more mainstream media. So that's one of the advantages of Honi Soit, that you can really advocate for a student voice, which is supposedly a unique voice within the public discourse.
Great. And the majority of your policy statement is recycled sort of from previous tickets. What would you say is something new that you're bringing to the table?
I think it's there's only so much you can really change in a newspaper which is the same size and has the same resources and so on. There's only so much you can change year on year. But again, I think the main thing is trying to get it to as broad an audience as possible and trying to be not exclusive in the demographic you're trying to write for or pitch to. I just think trying to broaden it as much as possible so it's a thing that as many people as possible are interested in and want to read and want to get involved in.
And I guess that what differentiates us from FIT this year is that we haven't been as news-centric, and FIT has been intensely news-centric, which has been really, really good. And we're hoping to take some of that forward. But our group also has quite a cultural focus and also an artistic focus. So we're also hoping to have quite a visual paper and a little bit more of a kind of showcase of some of the creatives on campus, which we think is a valuable thing that isn't necessarily capitalised on currently.
And just in terms of sort of broadening Honi's readership and the people sort of reporting for Honi, are there any specific ways you think you're going to go about doing that next year?
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of lecture bashing, and you can't just expect people to turn up and write for it. There's only a narrow section of people who are going to turn up at uni and say, I want to write in this public newspaper. You really have to get it out there. Obviously you'll target faculties that have a predisposition to writing and people who can string sentences together.
Yeah.
But also other there's no reason why engineering and science and commerce students shouldn't be writing. So I think, you just have to do your groundwork, I reckon.
Because that's also where our connections with like clubs and societies will come in. Because, for instance, there's Writing Society, which has a group of writers who are willing to write but just don't have anywhere to put it or aren't currently putting it into public publications. So we think that like that's also another opportunity to go beyond the arts bubble, if you will, because the clubs and societies attract more people than just those doing like arts and law, which is what Honi primarily attracts these days.
Yeah, I think another thing is, I don't know how previous years have done it, and this year's obviously a lot different, but trying to, like if you're writing for Honi, trying to make writers feel as though they're more involved in the paper, and that can just be a simple matter of having like social get-togethers of writers, so people know other people who are involved with the paper, and that'll spread to their friends and all that sort of stuff. So I think pandemic permitting, just trying to get as much face-to-face involvement with the paper and getting it out there to potential writers.
Yeah, all right. So moving on more specifically to kind of things you've mentioned in your policy statement. One thing you've mentioned is that you want to make the pitching process more discursive. Do you want to expand on sort of what that means, or what your sort of plans are for that?
Yeah, well, of course it's still in development because we haven't started our term, and we don't start until December, so we've still got a while to like work things out. But our main objective is to kind of like encourage greater discussion between editors and writers, particularly the first-time writers, because it can be quite intimidating when you're approaching an editor that you don't know, and you're trying to discuss your ideas, and sometimes there's a bit of hesitation as well to workshop. So we want to encourage people to workshop ideas and also potentially put in pitches earlier so that they can be discussed, particularly in the kind of culture sections or analysis sections where they may not be as like time pressing. So I guess that's kind of the main objective of making the pitching process more discursive. It's just kind of increasing the relationship between the writer and the editor.
Okay, cool. You've also mentioned specifically Alumni as a group of writers that you want to shine a light on. Why is that important to you as a ticket, and what is that going to look like? How do you intend to reach out to alumni?
Was that alumni in the sense of getting them to write for the paper, or just having them a subject? Oh, was it?
No, I think that it was basically subject matter.
Right.
So it was more engaging with what people from like UCID or even past Honi writers are doing presently. Because there are a lot of UCID alumni that are doing like really important and interesting things, and even Honi writers that are doing like really important and interesting things. So like having an eye on the university campus is one thing, but also being able to tell people that there's kind of like life beyond the university is another. So being able to shine a light on the future successes and also maybe some of the work that might be valuable or important to current students is, we think, like valuable and interesting.
So is that part of your like idea about doing more profiles and things like that? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Cool. You've also talked a little bit about engaging with satellite campuses and international students. What existing relationships does Bloom have with the satellite campuses or with international student bodies?
So we know, I don't know him, but I think we know the president or something like of the Brazil campus, or like Students Association.
Yeah. There are a lot of also friend connections with people in the arts campus, like the fine arts campus, and there are also quite a few connections between the con. So it's mostly those two, like the creative campuses, that we really want to showcase their work as well because it aligns well with Honi. So yeah, I guess that's it. And then also in terms of international students, on the ticket we don't have a large supply of international students, partly because currently there just aren't enough writing, and also because it's really difficult at the moment with COVID because a lot of the international students have been forced to go home. So it's a little bit more difficult to keep up open communication when people aren't around. But we do have Shania, who is an international student, and even though she's not from China, we kind of have this like slightly closed-minded conception that all international students are Chinese international students, and I think that we also need to broaden that mindset. and embrace international students from a variety of backgrounds. So we have Shania to connect with others, but we also have a lot of like friends or connections with some international students that could be interested in writing for the paper, but perhaps haven't had the chance yet or haven't had the kind of confidence to write for the paper.
Okay. Moving on to the types of content that you might be including, sport coverage was mentioned in your policy statement. By sport coverage, do you mean like reports on campus sport events, like what Cream pitched last year, or kind of just more analytical pieces about sport in general?
I think it wouldn't be anything too, like, it's not going to be a dedicated sports section every week, I don't think, but like, I don't know, I'm happy to go down and watch the rugby and write a report. There's people who are interested in writing about cricket and tennis, so there's plenty of people out there who are willing to write about those kind of things, and if they want to write about it, then we'll have it. And if there's significant sporting events on campus, like the rugby, which often gets televised, or big like the basketball, the women basketball is a professional, that kind of thing. If it's significant and on campus, then it's probably worth a report.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that sort of coverage hasn't really been done in Honi before. Is there anyone on Bloom that has like experience covering sport or like live sport events or things like that, of that nature?
I wrote match reports for like my under-12s rugby, but that's about it.
Right. Cool. Another policy that was has been pitched in the past is forming closer relationships with USU clubs and societies. So we heard a little bit about Writing Society before, but how else do you intend to kind of engage with clubs and societies?
Yeah, well, we're aware of the distinction between USU and SRC, and obviously the clubs and societies are kind of like a part of the USU and thus not really under the jurisdiction of Honi. So firstly, our engagement with them will be on the basis of trying to attract writers from them, because they're just like a group of people that have interests that align with what Honi needs, and thus like we could get some writers from those groups. But also we think that it's a good opportunity to increase the readership, because if you're discussing some of the events or some of the like things that are happening within those societies, not necessarily in the print of the paper, because we're aware of like the limitations of pages and that type of thing, and you don't really want to use pages for USU publicity, I guess. It's an opportunity to increase like online engagement with the online Honi publication.
Okay. Speaking of the USU, Honi has sometimes had a kind of, a parallel, sometimes competitive relationship with Pulp. So what role do you think Honi should have as an on-campus publication, in comparison to other publications like Pulp, or perhaps journals put out by SAS and those sorts of things?
Well, I think the journals are generally more literary, and kind of longer form writing, which you can have in Honi as well, but they're sort of more dedicated to that. As for Pulp, I don't really read it, but I don't know, I think Honi's like there on campus, and it's apparent and it's easy to see, and it's I don't know, you seem to hear about it a lot more often, so I don't think it's necessarily, I think they can coexist
I think
fine.
the distinction is also that Honi has a responsibility to hold the SRC to account and to kind of have a position within student politics in a more active way than Pulp would generally. So I think that's one of the kind of distinguishing factors of Honi Soit versus Pulp. Only I think that Max has fairly well covered it.
Okay, cool. Jumping back to kind of something you touched on before, Max, you mentioned your policy statement as well, that you're actively seeking writers from faculties across the university, and as you said before, presumably outside of like the traditional arts and law writer base. Do you think this is like an inherently bad thing that needs to be fixed, especially considering arts and law students are probably just writing more as part of their degree or as part of their vocation anyway? Do you think that's like an inherent problem that you guys want to fix, or?
I don't think it's a problem as such. Like, you're naturally going to get more art students and more law students writing, but it's always good to have people from all over the campus contributing, and I think it's worthwhile, even if I don't know, maybe no one wants to write from those faculties, but it's worth going out and trying to get them involved, because I just think the greater amount of people reading and engaging with Honi, the better it is for the campus and for the paper itself.
Because part of the problem with engagement from those faculties is often a confidence thing, or the idea that they can't write for Honi because they're not an arts or law student. So I kind of think that it's part of breaking down that barrier and just like encouraging people to think that like we'll almost democratize the writership of Honi, so that more people from like more disciplines are encouraged to write, rather than just the people that like write all the time per se.
Okay. We've also noticed that there's no mention, correct me if I'm wrong, of comedy or satire in your policy statement, which is, I guess, something that we as an Honi ticket have tried to push this year. How do you intend to approach comedic content next year?
I think that, this year's comedy's been, I've enjoyed it. And we'd like to continue that. Milo's written a bit of comedy.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think the pitch meetings that haven't happened as often as they would have, but I think it's still good to, like, that's something we like going out and, engaging with people to get pitches. I think, we'd be happy to continue doing that. But yeah, we'd still keep the comedy section. But I don't know if it's funny.
And then one last thing about policy. Close to the end of your statement, you talk about digital-focused content and expanding digital-focused content. What sorts of content is that going to look like, or what do you think you're producing?
Yeah, well, there are a few things. The first thing is the Instagram, because currently Instagram is mostly just visuals. So we kind of want to move away from the like strictly visual Instagram and also highlight some of the parts from articles or even infographics, because that's one thing that we kind of acknowledge that Pulp has been doing quite well this year, and we would like to introduce it to Honi but in a slightly different way. And also we want to engage more on the different social media platforms with kind of protest and also like public events reporting. So for instance, we were considering potentially having like audio recordings and things of different events so that you can get more perspectives and so that you can have a bit more of an immersive reporting experience, because we think that it would be valuable to, particularly when not everyone can go to protests and not everyone can go to public events at current, have a little bit more of an immersive interactive experience.
Cool. Moving on to sort of more about political stances and sort of the politics of your year. You've highlighted the importance of a progressive student media, though we think that the term progressive has become sort of increasingly confusing and like hard to pin down over the years. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of what you mean by progressive student media?
I think, I don't know, just the nature of the people in our ticket, it's going to be, I guess you'd say, a more left-wing ticket, as is normally as is the case with most Honi Soit tickets. I can't say exactly I can't define our political leanings because there's 10 of us. But yeah, the broad vibe, I guess, is progressiveness. But I can't define what progressive means.
Yeah, I guess generally progressive, that we're trying to put, you could say controversial, but just like more progressive, to use the word that you say has not been defined, opinions within the paper. So kind of like encouraging people to push barriers and maybe like even question what is in the norm. But yeah, generally like politically left and progressive. Yeah.
Okay. Would you have any, and obviously, I'm not expecting an answer to this question necessarily, but like, would you have any examples of like articles that your team likes that have been particularly progressive, or maybe even particular stances that you agree with, so we can just get a little bit of a clearer picture of where the team stands?
Well, I think that there have been a few articles, but like potentially a controversial one, which was Nina's Collective's article,
Okay.
Which came under quite a bit of scrutiny.
Yeah.
And also because there are members of our ticket that our own collectives. It was also like a little bit scrutinised within the paper, but in terms of like that kind of content, we don't really want to shy away from that kind of content. We'd be happy to embrace it and also to include it in our like content that we are hoping to produce in the next year.
Cool. Another phrase that you've used in your policy statement, which is perhaps a little bit confusing, is the issues that confront our generation. In your opinion, what do you think are the most important issues sort of facing students at the moment?
Obviously the funding cuts that are happening to universities. So like there's been a huge amount of politics surrounding university funding, surrounding the kind of like fees increases, also surrounding job cuts within the university. So those kinds of things that are like directly affecting us, obviously as students, but also as people that are potentially like more widely involved in the university. We think that that's a really important issue. Also environmental issues and climate change. We have a number of people in our ticket that have been quite involved in activism to do with like climate movements. So we think that like those are two of the primary issues that we would like to discuss or draw attention to.
And given something that you've highlighted already is the kind of, obviously the limited space that you have in Honi, it's usually 24 pages in addition, we have a budget that we have to work with. What issues would you then be sort of prioritising your coverage on if you had to pick from what you've just mentioned?
Well, I don't think we can say what's going to happen in
Sure,
the next
yeah.
year or so, but yeah, I think definitely a focus on some of the environmental things, and well, I imagine those are going to be continuing issues into next year, like the environment and uni cuts, as Juliet said. But I don't know, sort of depends on what pitches we get.
Yeah, and I guess you also need to prioritise time-sensitive content. So obviously, as Max has been saying, things change very drastically and in a very short amount of time in this political climate. And thus we need to be able to like prioritise the things that are kind of going to potentially go out of date or are going to change really quickly. So that's also at the front of our mind as editors.
Cool. Just a couple more questions on politics in general. You've also mentioned transparent journalism and, you know, holding uni administration to account, which is, you know, phrases that get thrown around quite a lot when it comes to Honi policy statements. What exactly do you mean by transparent journalism, or what's your idea of transparent journalism?
Well, I guess that transparent journalism means a few things. First of all, it's about encouraging as many like opinions as possible and not necessarily like closing opinions or like not allowing them to be published, but potentially kind of like encouraging discussion and debate rather than just like putting out one idea and saying that it's gospel. Another thing about transparency is also trying to like encourage transparency in the actual like university, because part of the role of a student paper is to hold people to account, which is obviously the buzzwords that you've been saying. But if you don't have, for instance, like in the SRC reports that come out every week from the officers in various positions, if you don't kind of like allow people to include things like within those parts of the paper, then you cut off people from the politics of the uni. So we think that it's important for Honi to increase the kind of engagement with student politics, but also like not kind of endorse hackery, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Okay. And one final question from me, and then I'll throw back to Lara. If you had to pick one Honi ticket from the past few years, excluding ours, who do you feel sort of most aligned with vision-wise?
I only really know, Spice.
Yeah.
So, Spice.
Spice?
Yeah.
How about politically? Would you say that you align with any particular year?
I don't really know. I'd say that Honi is generally like fairly pretty left. Use the haunted word of progressive. So yeah, I guess that like we generally align with historic Honi, but particularly the more kind of contemporary Honi tickets that have come up in the past like 5 or so years. But yeah, Spice, I guess, is one ticket that we align with in a few ways, partly because they were quite like heavy on visuals and cultural parts of the university institution. And I think that just like generally looking at what we as a ticket have written, our content as it stands probably aligns most with Spice.
Cool. So one challenge of editing Honi is that the paper often receives harsh criticism sort of from all corners of the campus, sometimes directed at authors, sometimes directed at editors. It can be, quite savage at times. So what sort of strategies or policies will your team implement when faced with such backlash, and how will you sort of work together to get through it?
Well, the first thing that we need to do is kind of discuss as a ticket, or like discuss as a group. Because if it's just one-on-one backlash, then it's not necessarily productive, and also it leads to kind of an unhealthy atmosphere. So I think that like the most productive thing in that frame is discussion among us, and also then kind of trying to think of like a potential response, how to support a writer if they're not in the Honi group, or like they're not in the editorial group. Yeah, I think that those are kind of the most important things to do in those cases. And also to be sensitive to the complainer or the complainant, because often, or like most times, they will have some kind of substantive reason as to why they are complaining, and you have to kind of put a bit of a light on yourself and think like whether your decisions or your opinions were actually like right or wrong. And sometimes you kind of need to be open to accepting some criticism, because we have to acknowledge that as editors we're not always going to be right, and the opinions that we publish aren't necessarily always going to be like the most thoroughly researched, or the opinions that we will like continue to agree with in 6 months or a year's time. So yeah, open-mindedness, discussion, and yeah, an appreciation of the fact that people can potentially be wrong.
I think also, like on more substantive issues, I'd like to encourage people to, if they have what they feel is a genuine disagreement that they can cogently argue and substantively argue, then they should be writing a rebuttal to be published in Honi, or at least a letter to the editor, instead of like writing usage rants. So if you think you have a decent case to argue, then argue it publicly by writing an article, is what I'd say for substantive disagreements. But yeah, that's what I'd say.
Cool. And so our ticket has been no stranger to controversy and some backlash throughout this year. So we've been criticised for our O Week front cover, the USU pullout, our Jew versus the Catholic comedy section, coverage of sort of college graffiti, amongst other things. Would Bloom have published sort of the aforementioned content, and why or why not?
I think that the cover for O Week was fairly harmless in many respects. Like, even though it's probably confronting for some, it's not anything that's like completely blasphemous. It's not anything that is like really that terrible. So I think that in regard to that one, yes, we probably would have published it. In regard to the Christian versus the Jew, obviously we can't speak for the Jewish community, who had a few problems with it, particularly one member of the Jewish community. So I think that like we'll refrain from commenting, because obviously like there were a Jewish and a Catholic writer that facilitated that content, so they had their own like ability to have those perspectives that we aren't necessarily liable to comment on or produce ourselves. So we think that that's like a kind of cultural issue within the paper that needs to be dealt with on the basis of like who is actually writing it and who is editing it. Only so long as the content is like fairly harmless. A lot of the comedy just kind of is satire, and satire is always going to be controversial, like that's the very nature of it. So yeah, we need to accept that and embrace it as a community, particularly as a progressive paper. Yeah.
And then I'm assuming from your answers to that you'd also be fine with the USU pullout that we published in our O Week edition generally?
I don't remember what was in it.
Yeah, I remember it generally. Whether the absolute boy bit, that was in the USU pullout, right? Yeah. USU, The absolute boy comment is similar to the Catholic and the Jew. We don't necessarily have the kind of like cultural or religious backgrounds to be able to necessarily publish that content ourselves. However, if there was something specific to our collective, then sure, like we would be open to publishing something that is like potentially controversial.
Cool. And so sort of following on from this, the threat of getting misconducted by the university is sort of becoming more and more sort of prevalent within the SRC. Going back to sort of like 2017, you've seen a real increase in misconduct cases, a lot of which are sort of like politically sort of motivated or actually like quite sort of vexatious complaints. In light of this, would you sort of tread a bit more carefully in terms of content that you're going to publish sort of because of this risk?
No, I don't think there's any. Well, I don't know the nature of the misconduct claims, but I don't think there's any reason, or nor should we, tone down the tone of Honi. It's at its best when it's sort of pushing boundaries. And, you know, often like, I know a lot, like if you're making complaints against a student paper, that probably, you know, says more about you than what's in the paper often, a lot of times. But yeah, I think that we definitely wouldn't tone down anything.
And if the student paper isn't controversial, it's kind of also not doing its job. Like if there aren't any views that people question or that people are willing to argue with, then no one would read it because it would be boring. So there still needs to be a willingness to like argue and to be controversial.
Cool. And now moving on, after Bloom was automatically elected, articles pitched by editors either failed to meet Honi's submission deadlines or dropped out completely after they'd been approved and paginated for the paper. This occurred 2 weeks in a row. To what do you sort of chalk up these mistakes, and do you think this reflects a larger problem in Bloom, and how will you seek to improve before your term begins?
The only one I know of was that COVID investigation thing, and we went and investigated, and there wasn't any substance to the investigation, so you can't really write what isn't there. So that was a matter of there not being anything to actually write about, but I don't know what the other instance was.
Yeah, I know what the other instance was. It was the photo essay.
Yeah.
The photo essay.
The photo essay that wasn't a photo essay, but anyway. Yeah, no, with that article particularly, it was like quite a sensitive topic that there were some last minute changes regarding privacy and whether or not people wanted to be published in a visual format. So I think that was a bit of a unique case. And I think that it's just kind of been two unique investigation style pieces that were kind of put back by some like forces that were out of the control of the writers in some respects. And that also were kind of like just subject to the kind of, I guess, like difficult process of having to get a piece in within a week. That requires a lot of research and that requires a lot of personal opinion from students and from other members of the community.
But yeah, obviously in future we'll do the investigation before we pitch the investigation.
Yeah, I guess just going back to the photo essay, that was actually pitched, I believe, like definitely over a week in advance, probably like 10 days, 2 weeks in advance. And I think a large problem with that was obviously sometimes articles are going to be late and, you know, it's fine. But it was like also a real lack of communication.
Between the writers.
Yeah, between the writers and me, who was like looking after editing the piece.
Yeah. I think that's also partly down to that there needs to be a greater sense of kind of communication between the writers and the editors, and not just accountability on part of the editors but also the writers. So that if you are running behind, then you just tell your editor so that they're aware. But also, yeah, that's, I guess, like greater communication is kind of the answer to that problem.
Yeah, and well, in future, if we're set a deadline, then everyone will stick to that deadline.
Cool. And final question, we've heard sort of a few weeks back that you were looking for an 11th editor, potentially a Mandarin speaking international student, potentially someone else. Do you still intend to sort of fill an 11th spot? Have you found one? Are you no longer looking? How's that going?
Yeah, no. We're no longer looking. It was kind of a bit of a last minute decision just because there are always the kind of trials and tribulations of the election process and of ticket formation and hesitation about whether people will like drop out or continue. But now I think we have a pretty solid base and we don't really want to mess with that foundation.
Beautiful. That's all from me. Do you have anything
No.
else you want to add?
I'm all good.
Anything you guys would like to add?
No.
No? All good. Beautiful. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming in.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.